My name is Ezra Washington, and I am writing this account from my home in Philadelphia, 14 years after the night I lost my sight, music, and gained something far more powerful, the ability to hear the truth that would eventually destroy one of Mississippi's most prominent families. If you wonder how a blind slave could bring down the mighty Beauregards of Magnolia Estate, then you must understand that sometimes what appears to be a curse is actually a gift, and that those who are underestimated music possess the greatest power of all. March 15, 1851 began like any other day on the Magnolia Estate, the sprawling cotton plantation that stretched across 10,000 acres of rich Mississippi Delta soil. I was 35 years old then, a skilled carpenter who had earned a measure of respect among both the enslaved community and the white overseers for my ability to build and repair anything from furniture to entire buildings. It was a position that afforded me certain privileges, better food, decent clothing, and the relative safety that came with being considered valuable property. The storm that would change my life forever began building in the early afternoon. Music, with dark clouds gathering on the horizon and the wind picking up until it howled through the massive oak trees, music that gave the plantation its name. By evening, rain was falling in sheets, and lightning split the sky with increasing frequency. It was the kind of weather that sensible people waited out indoors. But Colonel Marcus Beauregard was not known for his patience or his concern for the safety of his slaves. I was in my workshop putting the finishing touches on a mahogany dining table that the colonel had commissioned for his wife's birthday when he burst through the door with the imperious manner that characterized all his interactions with the enslaved people under his control. "Ezra," he barked, water dripping from his expensive coat. "There's a leak in the roof of the main house. Several tiles have come loose in the wind and water is pouring into the parlor. I need you to fix it immediately." I looked up from my work, noting the violence of the storm outside, music, and the dangerous flicker of lightning that seemed to be getting closer with each passing minute. "Colonel Beauregard, sir, with respect, it's not safe to be on a roof in this weather." "The lightning. I don't pay you to think about safety," he interrupted sharply. "I pay your master, which is to say I own you, to do what you're told when you're told to do it. The roof needs to be repaired now before the water damages the furniture and carpets." "Sir, if we could just wait until the storm passes." "We cannot wait," Music Beauregard said, his voice rising with anger. "My wife's birthday party is tomorrow evening, and I will not have water stains on the ceiling when our guests arrive. You will fix that roof now, or you will receive 50 lashes for disobedience. The choice is yours. It was no choice at all. Of course, 50 lashes could kill a man, or at the very least leave him permanently disabled. I had seen slaves die from lesser beatings, their bodies unable to withstand the systematic destruction of flesh and bone that the whip could inflict. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, I gathered my tools and followed the colonel out into the storm. The main house of Magnolia Estate was a monument to wealth built on human suffering. 3 stories of white-columned grandeur that rose from manicured gardens like a temple to the plantation aristocracy. Under normal circumstances, it was an impressive sight, but in the fury of the storm it looked ominous and forbidding, its windows glowing with lamplight that flickered in the wind. The ladder I needed to reach the damaged section of roof was already in place, having been set up by other slaves earlier in the day. As I climbed, the wind whipped at my clothes, and the rain stung my face like needles. Each step higher brought me closer to the lightning that continued to flash overhead with increasing intensity. The damaged tiles were on the east side of the house, where the wind had torn away several sections of the slate roofing and allowed water to pour into the rooms below. Working by the intermittent light of the lightning, I began the delicate process of replacing the broken tiles, my hands numb with cold, and my body soaked to the skin. I had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when I heard it, a sound like the world splitting open, followed by a flash of light so bright music it seemed to burn through my closed eyelids. The lightning had struck the massive oak tree that stood just 50 feet from the house, and the thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Music. But it was not the lightning itself that sealed my fate. It was my reaction to it. Startled by the deafening crash, I lost my footing on the wet slate tiles and began to slide toward the edge of the roof. I dropped my tools and tried desperately to find purchase on the smooth surface, but the rain had made everything slippery, and gravity was pulling me inexorably toward a 3-story fall that would almost certainly kill me. At the last moment, my fingers found the edge of the roof's gutter, and I managed to stop my slide. For a few seconds, I hung there in the wind and rain, my feet dangling over empty space, trying to summon the strength to pull myself back up to safety. That was when the second lightning strike came. This bolt hit the metal weather vane at the peak of the roof, sending electrical current racing through the building's metal fixtures. The gutter I was gripping conducted that electricity directly into my body, and I felt a sensation like being struck by the fist of God himself. Every muscle in my body convulsed, my grip was torn loose, and I fell. I remember the sensation of falling, the brief moment of weightlessness before impact. I remember hitting the stone steps that led up to the main house, my head striking the granite with a sound like a melon being dropped, music, and then I remember nothing at all. I awoke 3 days later in the slave infirmary, my head wrapped in bandages and my body aching from injuries I was only beginning to understand. Ruth, the elderly woman who served as the plantation's healer, was sitting beside my bed when consciousness returned, and the expression on her face told me immediately that something was terribly wrong. "Ezra, music," she said gently. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," I replied, though my voice sounded strange and distant to my own ears. "I can hear you, but I can't see anything." "Everything is dark." Ruth took my hand in hers, music, and I could feel the tremor in her fingers as she struggled to find the right words. "The lightning and then the fall. The doctor says the damage to your music head. Ezra, I'm so sorry, you're blind." The words hit me with more force than the lightning had. Blind. In a world where physical capability determined survival, where the ability to work meant the difference between life and death, blindness was essentially a death sentence. Slaves who could not work were either sold for whatever pittance they might bring, or music simply left to die. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Will it get better?" "The doctor doesn't think so," Ruth said, her voice heavy with grief. "The damage is too severe, Ezra. I'm so sorry." I lay in that narrow bed for hours after Ruth left, staring into a darkness that would be my companion for the rest of my life, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened to me. I was 35 years old in what should have been the prime of my life, and I had been reduced to helplessness by a moment of bad weather and worse judgment. But even as I mourned the loss of my sight, I began to notice something strange. The sounds around me seemed sharper, more distinct than they had ever been before. I could hear conversations taking place in other parts of the infirmary with perfect clarity. I could distinguish between different people's footsteps, identify voices I had never paid attention to before, even detect the subtle changes in breathing that music indicated emotion or deception. It was as if losing my sight had somehow enhanced my other senses, particularly my hearing. What I didn't realize at the time was that this enhancement would become the weapon I would use to destroy the very people who had caused my blindness. Colonel Bogart visited me on my 4th day in the infirmary, not out of concern for my welfare, but to assess the damage to his property. He stood at the foot of my bed, and even without seeing him, I could sense his displeasure and impatience. "Well, Ezra," he said, his voice carrying the same imperious tone that had sent me onto that roof, "the doctor tells me you're permanently blind." "Music. That makes you essentially worthless to me." "Sir," I said carefully, "I can still work. I can do simple tasks." "Help with? You can do nothing of value," he interrupted. "Music. A blind slave is a burden, not an asset. I should sell you to someone who specializes in damaged goods, but frankly, I doubt music anyone would want you." The casual cruelty of his words was like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain calm. "What will happen to me, sir?" "My wife has suggested we keep you on for simple household tasks, cleaning, carrying things, basic labor that doesn't require sight. It's more charity than you deserve, considering that your clumsiness has cost me a valuable worker." My clumsiness, as if I had chosen to be struck by lightning, as if I had deliberately fallen from his roof. But I said nothing, understanding that any protest would only make my situation worse. "You'll be moved to the main house," Bogart continued. "You'll work under the supervision of the house slaves, doing whatever menial tasks they assign you. And Ezra, you'll be grateful for this opportunity because it's more than most masters would offer a useless." After he left, I lay in the darkness and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The gratitude he expected would never come. The acceptance he demanded would never be given. Instead, a cold anger began to grow in my chest, fed, music, by the injustice of my situation and the callous indifference of the man who had caused it. I had lost my sight, but I was beginning to understand that I had gained something else, the ability to hear truths that others thought were hidden, to observe without being observed, to gather information while appearing harmless and insignificant. Colonel Marcus Beauregard thought he had reduced me to nothing. He thought he had taken away my value, my purpose, my power. He was wrong on all counts. I was about to become the most dangerous person on Magnolia Estate, precisely because no one would ever suspect a blind slave of being dangerous at all. The education in revenge was about to begin, and my teachers would be the very people who had destroyed my life. They would speak freely in my presence, reveal their secrets without fear, expose their crimes without concern, and I would listen. I would remember, and when the time was right, I would use their own words to bring their world crashing down around them. The darkness that had taken my sight would become the shadow in which I would hide while gathering the weapons that would eventually destroy the Beauregard family completely. The transition from skilled carpenter to household music servant was both humiliating and reveille. Within a week of leaving the infirmary, I found myself assigned to the most menial tasks imaginable, sweeping floors, carrying laundry, polishing silver, and performing the countless small duties that kept the Beauregard mansion functioning. To the family and their guests, I became music invisible, a piece of human furniture that moved silently through their world without attracting notice or concern. But invisibility, I quickly discovered, was the most powerful tool I had ever possessed. My first revelation came during my second week in the main music house as I was dusting the furniture in Colonel Beauregard's study, while he met with his banker, a nervous man named Whitfield, who had traveled from Natchez to discuss the plantation's finances. I worked silently in the corner, moving my cloth over surfaces I could not see, while the two men spoke in voices they believed were too low for a simple slave to overhear. "The situation is becoming untenable, Marcus," Whitfield was saying, his voice tight with anxiety. "The loans are coming due and the cotton prices have been lower than projected for 3 consecutive seasons. You're already 6 months behind on the principal payments, and the interest is compounding daily." "How much time do I have?" Beauregard asked, and I could hear the strain in his voice despite his attempt to maintain his usual commanding tone. 6 months, perhaps 8 if we can negotiate extensions. "But Marcus, you need to understand, if you default on these loans, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. Magnolia Estate, the house, the slaves, everything will be seized and sold at auction." "That cannot happen," Beauregard said firmly. "Music. This plantation has been in my family for 3 generations. I will not be the one to lose it." "Then you need to find additional sources of income or drastically reduce your expenses." "The gambling debts are my business," Beauregard interrupted sharply. "I'll handle them in my own way." As I listened to this conversation, carefully maintaining the slow, methodical movements of my cleaning, while my mind raced with the implications of what I was hearing, I realized that I had stumbled upon information that could be incredibly valuable. The mighty Colonel Beauregard, the man who had sent me onto a roof in a lightning storm and then dismissed my resulting blindness as mere clumsiness, was facing financial ruin. But this was only the beginning. Over the following months, as I moved through the house like a ghost, always present but never acknowledged, I began to accumulate a treasure trove of secrets that revealed the true nature of the Beauregard family. The most shocking discovery came in the late summer of 1851 when I was cleaning the parlor while Mrs. Amelia Beauregard entertained a visitor. I had been told that Dr. Harrison, the plantation's physician, was calling to check on Amelia's health, as she had been complaining of various ailments that seemed to require frequent medical attention. But the conversation I overheard had nothing to do with medicine. "Marcus will be away until Thursday," Amelia was saying, her voice carrying a breathless quality that I had never heard before. "We'll have 3 days together, just like we planned." "I've missed you terribly," Dr. Harrison replied, and the intimate tone of his voice made it clear that this was no ordinary doctor-patient relationship. "These stolen moments aren't enough anymore, Amelia. I want to be with you always." "You know that's impossible," she said, though her voice carried longing rather than rejection. "Marcus would kill us both if he discovered our affair. We must be patient, my darling. We must wait for the right opportunity." "What if we didn't have to wait?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that I had to strain to hear. "What if Marcus were to have an accident or fall ill with something that couldn't be cured?" "James," Amelia said, using the doctor's first name with an intimacy that confirmed the nature of their relationship. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about freedom," he replied. "Freedom to be together without hiding, without shame, without fear. Marcus is not a young man, Amelia. It wouldn't be difficult to arrange something that appeared natural." "We couldn't, could we?" "Leave it to me," Harrison said. "I have access to medications that could cause a heart attack. Make it look like natural causes. No one would suspect anything. As I listened to this conversation, my hands continued their mechanical polishing of the silver candlesticks. But my mind was reeling with the implications of what I had heard. Mrs. Bogard and Dr. Harrison were not just having an affair. They were planning to murder Colonel Bogard. This information was dangerous beyond measure. If I were discovered listening to such a conversation, I would be killed immediately. But it was also potentially powerful, a weapon that could be used against the people who had destroyed my life. I filed the information away in my memory along with every detail I could recall. The date, the exact words spoken, the tone of voice, the emotional undertones. My blindness had forced me to develop an extraordinary memory for auditory information, and I was beginning to realize that this skill might be more valuable than any physical ability I had ever possessed. The secrets continued to accumulate throughout 1852 and 1853. I learned that Robert Bogard, the colonel's 25-year-old son and heir, was stealing money from his father's accounts to pay gambling debts that exceeded his annual allowance by thousands of dollars. I overheard conversations that revealed he had also been forcing himself on several of the female slaves, treating them as his personal property in ways that went beyond even the normal brutalities of slavery. I discovered that Judge Thompson, one of Colonel Bogard's closest friends and frequent dinner guests, was involved in a scheme to steal land from smaller farmers through forged documents and corrupt legal proceedings. The two men would meet in the colonel's study after dinner, drinking expensive whiskey while planning the destruction of honest families whose only crime was owning property that the colonel coveted. Most shocking of all, I learned that Catherine Bogard, the colonel's 22-year-old daughter, was secretly working with the Underground Railroad to help slaves escape to freedom. She would slip out of the house at night, meeting with conductors who guided runaways north, providing them with food, money, and information about safe routes. Each piece of information was carefully cataloged in my memory, along with the specific details that would be needed to prove the truth of what I had heard. I knew the dates of meetings, the amounts of money involved, the names of co-conspirators, the methods used to conceal illegal activities. But it was the personal tragedy that struck in 1854 that transformed my patient accumulation of information into an active desire for revenge. I had been married to a woman named Sarah for 12 years, and we had been blessed with 2 children, a son named Samuel, who was 10 years old, and a daughter named Mary, who was 8. They lived in the slave quarters while I worked in the main house, but I was able to see them every evening and on Sundays, maintaining the family bonds that were so precious in a world designed to destroy them. In the spring of 1854, Colonel Bogard decided to sell 40 slaves to raise money for his mounting debts. Sarah and our children were among those selected for sale, not because they were troublesome or unproductive, but simply because they would bring good prices at auction. Music. When I learned of the planned sale, I threw myself at the colonel's feet, begging him to reconsider. "Please, sir," I pleaded. "They are my family, my wife, my children. I'll work twice as hard. I'll do anything you ask, but please don't separate us. You'll do exactly what you've always done," Music Bogard replied coldly. "Which is whatever I tell you to do. You have no rights in this matter, Ezra. You own nothing, including your so-called family. They are my property, and I'll dispose of them as I see fit." "Sir, I'm begging you. You're annoying me," he interrupted. "Music. And if you continue to annoy me, I'll have you whipped for insubordination. Your family will be sold because I need the money." And that's music, the end of the discussion. 3 days later, I stood in the yard of Magnolia Estate and listened as my wife and children were loaded into a wagon that would carry them to the slave market in Natchez. Sarah tried to be brave for the children's sake. Music. But I could hear the tears in her voice as she whispered goodbye. Samuel and Mary cried openly, not understanding why they were being taken away from their father, not comprehending that they might never see me again. "Papa!" Mary called out as the wagon began to move. "When will you come get us?" I had no answer for her because I knew the truth that she was too young to understand. I would never see any of them again. They would be sold to different plantations scattered across the South like leaves in a hurricane, and I would spend the rest of my life wondering what had become of them. As the wagon disappeared down the tree-lined drive that led away from Magnolia Estate, I felt something die inside me. The last vestiges of hope, of acceptance, of willingness to endure my circumstances with dignity. All of it was consumed by a rage so pure and cold that it seemed to burn without heat. That night, Music alone in my small room in the servants' quarters of the main house, I made a music decision that would shape the remaining years of my life. I would use the information I had gathered and the information I would continue to gather to destroy the Bogard family as completely as they had destroyed mine. I would be patient. I would be careful. I would wait for the perfect moment to strike. But when that moment came, I would show them the same mercy they had shown me, which is to say, none at all. The accumulation of secrets continued throughout 1854 and 1855, but now it had a purpose beyond mere survival. I was building a case against my oppressors, gathering evidence that would eventually be used to bring them to justice. I learned that Colonel Bogard had murdered a neighboring farmer named Jenkins by poisoning his well water, then purchasing the man's land from his widow at a fraction of its value. I overheard the confession during one of his drunken arguments with Amelia, when guilt and alcohol combined to loosen his tongue. I discovered that Robert had raped at least 6 different slave women, treating them as objects for his pleasure and threatening to have them sold if they resisted or complained. Music. The conversations I overheard between him and his friends revealed a casual attitude towards sexual violence that was shocking even by the standards of a slave society. I learned that Dr. Harrison and Amelia had refined their murder plot, music, deciding to use a slow-acting poison that would simulate the symptoms of heart disease, allowing Harrison to declare the death natural while avoiding suspicion. Each revelation was carefully stored in my memory, music, along with the corroborating details that would be needed to prove the truth of the accusations. I knew where Colonel Bogard had hidden the bottle of poison used to kill Jenkins. I knew the names and locations of Robert's victims. I knew the specific poison that Harrison planned to use on the colonel. By early 1856, I had accumulated enough information to destroy every member of the Bogard family except Catherine, whose only crime was trying to help enslaved people escape to freedom. But I still needed a way to act on this information, a method of bringing these secrets to light that would not immediately result in my own death. The solution came from an unexpected source, Catherine herself, the one member of the family who still possessed a functioning moral compass. In March of 1856, I overheard a conversation between Catherine and her mother that revealed the depth of her disgust with her family's behavior. She had discovered Robert's sexual assaults on the slave women and had confronted him about it, only to be told that it was none of her business what he did with his father's property. "I can't stand it anymore," she told Amelia during what she thought was a private conversation in the garden. "The way Robert treats those poor women, the way Father treats everyone like they're not even human. This isn't how Christians are supposed to behave." "You're being naive, Catherine," Amelia replied. "This is simply the way the world works. We are superior to them, and they exist to serve us. The sooner you accept that reality, the happier you'll be." "I'll never accept it," Catherine said firmly, "and I'll never stop trying to help them when I can." It was then that I realized Catherine might be the ally I needed to bring the family's crimes to light. She had access to writing materials, to the postal system, to contacts outside the plantation, who might be willing to act on information about criminal behavior. The question was whether she would be willing to help destroy her own family, even if it meant exposing crimes that demanded justice. I was about to find out. The opportunity to approach Catherine came in July of 1856 during one of those sweltering Mississippi afternoons, music, when the heat seemed to press down on the plantation like a suffocating blanket. I was cleaning the library, moving slowly among the leather-bound volumes that I could no longer see, but could identify by their distinctive smells and textures. When Catherine entered the room carrying what sounded like correspondence, she had been crying. I could hear it in the subtle changes in her breathing, the occasional sniffle she tried to suppress, the way her footsteps lacked their usual confident rhythm. For several minutes, she sat at the writing desk near the window, and I could hear the soft scratching of a pen on paper, interrupted by occasional sighs of frustration or despair. "Miss Catherine," I said quietly, speaking for the first time in her presence since my accident 5 years earlier. She gasped, clearly startled by my voice. "Ezra, I didn't realize you could. I mean, music, I thought you were." "I can speak, Miss Catherine," I said, setting down my dusting cloth and turning toward the sound of her voice. "I've just learned that sometimes it's better to listen than to talk." "What do you mean?" she asked, and I could hear the weariness in her voice. She was wondering why a slave was initiating conversation with her, what I might want, whether this interaction might somehow get her in trouble. "I mean that I've been listening for 5 years, Miss Catherine. Listening to conversations that people thought I couldn't hear." learning secrets that people thought were safe to share in front of a blind slave. And I know about your work with the Underground Railroad. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear her heart beating, could sense the fear and panic that music must be racing through her mind. Some discovery of her abolitionist activities would mean social ruin at best. Criminal prosecution at worst. I don't know what you're talking about, she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. You meet with conductors on the third Thursday of every month, I continued gently. You provide them with food, money, and information about safe routes north. Last month, you helped a family of 4 escape from the Morrison plantation. The month before that, there was 2 young men from Judge Thompson's place. How could you possibly know that? She whispered. Because music, hear everything, Miss Catherine. I hear you leaving the house at night. I hear you talking to your contacts. I hear you crying afterward when you think about the families that are still trapped here, still suffering. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and I could sense her struggling with the implications of what I had revealed. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Are you going to tell my father? No, Miss Catherine. I'm going to ask for your help. My help with what? With bringing justice to this family, with exposing the crimes that your father, your brother, your mother, and Dr. Harrison have committed. With using their own secrets to destroy them the way they've destroyed so many others. Another long silence. And then, what crimes? What secrets? And so I told her. For the next hour, speaking in the same quiet voice I had used to break the silence between us, I revealed everything I had learned during my 5 years of invisible observation. I told her about her father's gambling debts and financial fraud, about the murder of Farmer Jenkins, about the land theft scheme with Judge Thompson. I told her about her mother's affair with Dr. Harrison and their plot to poison her father. I told her about Robert's systematic rape of slave women and his theft of family money. With each revelation, I could hear Catherine's breathing become more labored, could sense her growing horror at the scope of her family's criminality. When I finished, she was crying again. Not the quiet tears of frustration I had heard when I first entered the room, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose entire world had been shattered. It can't be true, she said through her tears. My father, my mother. They're not perfect, but they're not murderers. They're not. I can prove everything I've told you, I said quietly. I know where your father hid the poison bottle he used to kill Jenkins. I know the exact words your mother and Dr. Harrison used when they planned your father's murder. I know the names of every woman your brother has assaulted. I remember every detail, Miss Catherine, because my blindness has, music, given me a perfect memory for sound. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Music. Why not go to the authorities yourself? Because I'm a slave, Miss Catherine. No one would believe my word against that of white people, no matter how much evidence I could provide. But you have credibility. You have access to the outside world, music. You have the ability to make people listen. You want me to destroy my own family. I want you to stop them from destroying others. I corrected. Your father sold my wife and children to pay his gambling debts. Your brother rapes women who have no way to defend themselves. Your mother is planning to murder your father for money and love. These are not good people, Miss Catherine. They are criminals who happen to be your relatives. Catherine was quiet for several minutes, and I could hear her moving around the room, pacing as she tried to process what I had told her. Finally, music. She returned to her chair and spoke in a voice that was steadier than before. What exactly are you asking me to do? Write letters, I said. I'll tell you what to write. Music, then you'll send them to the appropriate people. Letters to your father's creditors revealing his hidden debts and fraudulent financial records. Letters to the sheriff providing evidence of the murder and land theft. Letters to newspapers, music exposing the corruption. Letters to abolitionists in the North documenting the crimes against enslaved people. Music. And what happens to me when all of this comes to light? When my family is destroyed and everyone knows I was the one who exposed them, you'll be free, I said simply. Free from the guilt of knowing about these crimes and doing nothing to stop them. Free from the burden of being part of a family that profits from murder and rape and theft. Free to use your conscience instead of your bloodline to determine your actions. It will ruin me socially. No one in Mississippi society will ever speak to me again. Then perhaps it's time to find better society. Music. I suggested the abolitionists you work with would welcome you. The North is full of people who believe in justice rather than privilege. You could start a new life, one based on your own values rather than your family's crimes. Catherine stood up and walked to the window, and I could hear her looking out at the plantation grounds where so much suffering had taken place over the years. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new resolve. "You said you could prove everything. Show me." Over the next several days, Catherine and I worked together, music, to verify the information I had gathered. I led her to the hiding place in the library where her father had concealed the poison bottle used to kill Jenkins, behind a false panel in the bookshelf that contained his collection of agricultural texts. I provided her with specific music dates and times when she could observe her mother and Dr. Harrison together, confirming the affair I had described. I gave her the names of Robert's victims and suggested ways she could speak with them privately to confirm their stories. Each piece of evidence we uncovered strengthened Catherine's resolve to act. She was particularly horrified by Robert's treatment of the enslaved women, several of whom she had known since childhood. The realization that her brother was a serial rapist and that her parents either didn't know or didn't care seemed to be the final straw that broke her emotional connection to her family. "I can't be part of this anymore," she told me after speaking with one of Robert's victims, a young woman named Lucy, who had been too terrified to resist his attacks. "I can't sit at the same table with him. Can't pretend that we're a normal family when I know what he's done." "Then help me stop him," I said. "Help me stop all of them. What do you need me to write?" For the next month, Catherine served as my secretary, transcribing the letters I dictated, while I provided the specific details that would make each accusation impossible to ignore or dismiss. We worked in secret, usually in the early morning hours when the rest of the family was still asleep, using Catherine's personal stationery and her access to the postal system to send our revelations to their intended targets. The first letter went to the bank in Natchez, detailing Colonel Bogart's hidden gambling debts and the fraudulent financial records he had used to secure loans he could never repay. We provided specific account numbers, dates of transactions, and the names of witnesses who could confirm the information. The second letter went to Sheriff Morrison in the county seat, providing evidence of the murder of Farmer Jenkins and the location where the poison bottle could be found. We included details about the land purchase that had followed Jenkins' death and the suspicious circumstances surrounding the transaction. The third letter went to the editor of the Natchez Democrat, exposing the land theft scheme involving Judge Thompson and providing documentation of the forged deeds and corrupt legal proceedings that had been used to steal property from honest farmers. The fourth letter went to Mrs. Harrison, Dr. Harrison's wife, revealing her husband's affair with Amelia Bogart and their plot to murder Colonel Bogart. We provided specific dates when the affair had taken place and detailed descriptions of the poison that Harrison planned to use. The fifth and most comprehensive letter went to William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist editor, documenting the systematic rape and abuse of enslaved women by Robert Bogart and providing a detailed account of the conditions on Magnolia Estate. Each letter was carefully crafted to provide maximum impact while protecting Catherine's identity as much as possible. We signed them a concerned citizen and mailed them from different post offices to avoid creating a pattern that might be traced back to the plantation. As we sealed the last envelope and prepared to send it on its way, Catherine looked at me with an expression I could not see, but could sense in her voice. "There's no going back after this," she said. "Once these letters reach their destinations, everything will change." "Everything has already changed," I replied. "We're just making sure that other people know about it." "Are you sure this is the right thing to do, destroying a family, even one as flawed as mine?" "I'm sure it's the necessary thing to do," I said. "Your family has been destroying other families for years. It's time for that to stop." Catherine nodded, though I could not see the gesture. "Then let's finish what we started." The letters were mailed in the first week of September 1856, sent out like arrows aimed at the heart of the Bogart Empire. All that remained was to wait for them to find their targets, and to watch as the family that had ruled Magnolia Estate for 3 generations finally faced the consequences of their crimes. The reckoning was coming, and it would be more devastating than even I had dared to hope. September 1856 brought with it the kind of suffocating heat that made even the simplest tasks feel overwhelming. But the weather was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break over Magnolia Estate. The letters Catherine and I had sent were making their way to their intended recipients, carrying with them the power to destroy lives, reputations, and fortunes that had been built on decades of crime and cruelty. The first blow fell on September 8th when 3 representatives from the Natchez Bank arrived at the plantation in a carriage that kicked up clouds of dust as it raced down the Oakline Drive. I was polishing silver in the dining room when they were shown into Colonel Bogart's study, their voices carrying the kind of urgency that suggested serious trouble. "Colonel Bogart," the lead banker said without preamble, "Music, we've received some very disturbing information about your financial situation. Information that suggests you've been less than honest about your assets and liabilities. I don't know what you're talking about, Beauregard replied, but I could hear the tension in his voice, the slight tremor that indicated he knew exactly what they were talking about. We're talking about gambling debts totaling over $40,000, the banker continued. We're talking about forged documents used to secure loans. We're talking about hidden accounts and fraudulent financial statements. Should I continue? The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, could sense the panic that must be racing through Beauregard's mind as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies had been exposed. Where did you get this information? He asked finally. That's not your concern, the banker replied. What is your concern is that we're calling in all your loans immediately. You have 72 hours to repay the full amount, principal and interest, or we'll begin foreclosure proceedings on this property. 72 hours? Beauregard's voice cracked with disbelief. That's impossible. I need time to liquidate assets, to arrange. You've had years to arrange your finances properly, the banker interrupted. Instead, you chose to gamble away your family's fortune and lie to your creditors. The time for arrangements has passed. After the bankers left, I could hear Beauregard pacing in his study, his footsteps heavy with desperation and rage. He was muttering to himself, trying to calculate how much money he could raise in 3 days, but even I could tell that the numbers didn't add up. Magnolia Estate was about to fall, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The second blow came 2 days later when Sheriff Morrison arrived with a warrant for Beauregard's arrest. I was cleaning the front parlor when the sheriff's carriage pulled up to the house, and I could hear the jingle of handcuffs as he climbed the steps to the front door. Connell Marcus Beauregard, the sheriff announced when Beauregard answered the door. You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Jenkins. Murder? Beauregard's voice rose to a near shout. That's preposterous. Jenkins died of natural causes. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what you wanted them to know, Sheriff Morrison replied. But we've received information about how he really died and where you hid the evidence. We found the poison bottle, Marcus, hidden exactly where our informant said it would be. What informant? Who would dare? That's not your concern right now, the sheriff said, echoing the banker's words from 2 days earlier. What is your concern is that you're going to jail to await trial for murder. As they led Beauregard away in chains, I could hear Amelia screaming from the upstairs window, her voice shrill with panic and disbelief. The master of Magnolia Estate, the man who had ruled over hundreds of lives with absolute authority, was being taken away like a common criminal, but the destruction was just beginning. The third blow came the following day when Judge Thompson arrived at the plantation in a state of barely controlled panic. I was dusting the library when he burst through the front door, calling for Amelia with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope. They know about the land deals, he told her without preamble. Someone has exposed everything, the forged deeds, the corrupt court proceedings, all of it. The newspaper is running a front-page story tomorrow, and the state attorney general is opening an investigation. How is that possible? Amelia asked, her voice hollow with shock. Who could know about those transactions? I don't know, but someone has detailed records of everything we did. Dates, amounts, the names of everyone involved. It's over, music, Amelia. My career is finished, and I'll be lucky if I don't end up in prison with Marcus. What about the money, the properties we acquired? All of it will have to be returned, Thompson said bitterly. Every acre, every dollar, and will probably face criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. As Thompson left his political career and judicial reputation in ruins, I felt a deep satisfaction at hearing the fear in his voice. This was a man who had used his position to steal from honest farmers who had perverted the law to serve his own greed. Now he was facing the same kind of powerlessness that his victims had experienced. The fourth blow was perhaps the most personal, striking at the heart of the family's private relationships. Dr. Harrison's wife had received our letter about her husband's affair and murder plot, and she had wasted no time in confronting the guilty music parties. I was in the kitchen when Mrs. Harrison arrived, her carriage wheels crunching on the gravel drive with the sound of approaching judgment. She marched into the house without waiting to be announced, her voice carrying clearly through the halls as she demanded to see Amelia. "You adulteress!" she screamed when she found Amelia in the morning room. "You scheming, murdering, did you think I wouldn't find out about your affair with my husband?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Amelia replied. Music, but her voice lacked conviction. "Don't lie to me," Mrs. Harrison shrieked. "I know about your meetings, your plans to poison Marcus, everything. Someone has told me exactly what you've been doing, and I'm going to make sure everyone in Mississippi knows what kind of woman you really are." The confrontation that followed was spectacular in its viciousness, with Mrs. Harrison revealing intimate details of the affair and the murder plot to anyone within earshot. By the time she left, promising to ruin Amelia's reputation throughout the state, the entire household staff knew that their mistress was both an adulteress and a would-be murderer. Dr. Harrison himself arrived later that evening, his medical practice already in ruins, as word of the scandal spread through the community. I could hear him pleading with Amelia to run away with him, to escape to somewhere they could start over, but she was too devastated by the collapse of her world to make any coherent plans. "It's over, James," she told him through her tears. "Everything is over. My husband is in jail. My reputation is destroyed. My family is ruined. There's nowhere to run from this." "We could go west," Harrison suggested, music desperately. "Cal, Oregon, somewhere they don't know us. With what money?" Amelia laughed bitterly. "The bank is foreclosing on the plantation. Everything we own will be sold to pay Marcus's debts. I'll be lucky if I have enough money for a train ticket, let alone a new life." The fifth and final blow came when Robert was arrested for rape, based on testimony from 6 different women who had finally found the courage to speak out against their attacker. The abolitionist networks that had received our letter had worked quickly to document the crimes and present evidence to federal authorities, music who were less likely to be corrupted by local influence. I was in the parlor when the federal marshals came for Robert, their authority superseding any local protection he might have expected. Unlike his father's arrest, which, music, had been conducted with a certain degree of respect for his social position, Robert was treated like the common criminal. He was roughly handcuffed and dragged from the house while he protested his innocence. "This is a mistake," he shouted as they forced him into their wagon. "Those women are lying. They're slaves. Their testimony doesn't count for anything." "It counts for something with us," one of the marshals replied grimly, "and it's going to count for something with the federal judge who'll be trying your case." As the wagon carrying Robert disappeared down the drive, I felt a profound sense of justice being served. This was a man who had used his position and power to brutalize women who had no way to defend themselves, who had treated human beings as objects for his pleasure. Now, he would face the consequences of his actions in a court that wouldn't be swayed by his family's influence or social standing. By the end of September 1856, the Bogard family had been completely destroyed. Music. Marcus was in jail awaiting trial for murder. Robert was in federal custody facing rape charges. Amelia was a social pariah, abandoned by her lover and facing financial ruin. Judge Thompson had been forced to resign in disgrace and was facing his own criminal charges. Dr. Harrison had fled the state, his medical license revoked, and his reputation destroyed. Magnolia estate itself was in the process of being seized by creditors. Its vast acres and grand mansions soon to be sold at auction to pay the family's debts. The slaves who had worked the plantation for generations faced an uncertain future. But at least they would no longer be under the control of the Bogards. Only Catherine remained untouched by the scandal. Her role in exposing her family's crimes still secret. She had watched the destruction unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, knowing that justice was being served, but grieving for the family she had once loved despite their flaws. "It's finished," she told me as we stood in the library where our conspiracy had begun. "They're all destroyed, just as you said they would be." "Justice has been served," I replied. "Your father, your brother, your mother, they all got exactly what they deserved." "And what about me?" Catherine asked. "What happens to me now that my family is gone?" "You're free," I said simply. "Free to live according to your own conscience instead of your family's expectations. Free to help people instead of oppressing them. Free to be the person you were meant to be." "And you? What happens to you when the plantation is sold?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But whatever happens, it will be better than serving the people who destroyed my family and ruined my life. At least now I have the satisfaction of knowing that they paid for their crimes." As we spoke, I could hear the sounds of the plantation beginning to shut down, overseers leaving, slaves being told that they would soon be sold or freed, the great machinery of oppression grinding to a halt. The Bogard empire that had seemed so permanent, so unshakable, had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Music brought down by the very secrets its members had thought were safe to share in the presence of a blind slave. The reckoning was complete, and it had been music more devastating than even I had dared to hope. But the story was not over yet. Music. There were still consequences to be faced, futures to be determined, and lives to be rebuilt from the ashes of the old order. The destruction of the Bogard family was just the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Magnolia Estate, and in my own journey from slavery to something that might eventually resemble music freedom. The trials that followed the collapse of the Bogard Empire were swift and merciless. Music conducted in a legal system that had finally been forced to confront crimes too egregious to ignore. I attended each proceeding as a witness, my testimony providing the crucial details that sealed the fate of my former oppressors. Colonel Marcus Bogard's trial for the murder of Thomas Jenkins began in October 1856, held in the county courthouse, where Judge Thompson had once dispensed his corrupt version of justice. The evidence against Bogard was overwhelming. The poison bottle found exactly where I had said it would be. Testimony from witnesses who had seen him near Jenkins' property on the night of the murder, and financial records showing his immediate purchase of the victim's land at below market prices. When I took the witness stand, the courtroom fell silent as I recounted the confession I had overheard during one of Bogard's drunken arguments with his wife. My blindness, which had once made me invisible and therefore dangerous, now lent credibility to my testimony. The jury understood that a man who could not see had no reason to lie about what he had heard. The defendant said, and I, music quote, I testified, my voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Jenkins got what he deserved for refusing to sell, a little poison in his well water, and suddenly his widow was much more reasonable about the price. Bogard's defense attorney tried to discredit my testimony by emphasizing my status as a slave and my obvious motive for revenge, but the physical evidence corroborated every detail of my account. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Marcus Bogard was sentenced to death by hanging. Music, a fate that seemed fitting for a man who had shown no mercy to his victims. He was executed on November 15, 1856. His last words reportedly being a curse against the blind who had destroyed his family. Robert Bogard's federal trial for rape was equally decisive. 6 women testified against him, music their courage inspired by the knowledge that their attacker was finally facing justice. I provided testimony about the conversations I had overheard in which Robert had bragged about his assaults, describing them in graphic detail that left no doubt about his guilt. The federal judge appointed from outside Mississippi and therefore immune to local pressure showed no sympathy for Robert's claims that his victims were just slaves, whose testimony shouldn't be believed. In this court, he declared, all victims of crime are equal under the law, regardless of their race or social status. Robert was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a term that would likely prove to be a death sentence given the conditions in federal penitentiaries and the treatment that rapists typically received from other inmates. Judge Thompson's trial for corruption and fraud resulted in a 10-year prison sentence and the forfeit of all property he had acquired through his illegal schemes. His fall from grace was particularly satisfying to witness, as this was a man who had perverted the law to serve his own greed and had shown no mercy to the honest farmers he had cheated. Dr. Harrison was never captured, having fled to parts unknown when the scandal broke, but his medical license was permanently revoked. His property was seized to pay restitution, music, to his victims, and wanted posters bearing his description were distributed throughout the Western territories. He would spend the rest of his life as a fugitive, never able to practice medicine again or live openly under his own name. Amelia Bogard faced no criminal charges, as adultery was not a federal crime, and the murder plot had never been carried out, but her social destruction was complete. Shunned by former friends, abandoned by her lover, and left penniless by her husband's debts, she was forced to leave Mississippi and seek refuge with distant relatives in Arkansas. She died in poverty and obscurity, music, in 1860. Her name remembered only as a cautionary tale about the consequences of moral corruption. The sale of Magnolia Estate took place in December 1856, with the property being purchased by a consortium of northern businessmen who had plans to convert it into a more efficient agricultural operation. As part of the sale agreement, all slaves on the property, music, were to be freed, a condition that had been insisted upon by the new owners who had abolitionist sympathies. On December 20th, 1856, I stood in the same yard where I had watched my family being loaded into a wagon for sale 2 years earlier, and listened as a federal official read the proclamation that granted freedom to every enslaved person on the plantation. It was a moment I had never dared to dream possible, the end of a nightmare that had lasted my entire life. But freedom, I quickly discovered, was more complicated than I had imagined. At 40 years old, blind and with no resources beyond the clothes on my back, I faced an uncertain future in a world that was still hostile to people who looked like me, regardless of their legal status. Catherine Bogard proved to be my salvation during those first difficult weeks of freedom. She had inherited a small trust fund from her grandmother that had been protected from her father's creditors, and she used this money to help the freed slaves of Magnolia Music Estate transition to their new lives. "I owe you everything," she told me as we prepared to leave the plantation forever. "You gave me the courage to do what was right, even when it meant destroying my own family." "You gave me the means to seek justice," I replied. "Without your help, all the secrets I had gathered would have died with me." Catherine had decided to move north, where she could work openly with abolitionist organizations and help other enslaved people escape to freedom. She offered to take me with her, and I gratefully music accepted. Together, we traveled to Philadelphia, where the large community of free blacks and sympathetic whites offered the best chance for both of us to build new lives. In Philadelphia, music, I discovered that my unique combination of skills, my perfect auditory memory, my ability to remain unnoticed while gathering information, and my intimate knowledge of how slavery operated made me valuable to the Underground Railroad and other organizations working to help fugitive slaves. I became, music, what they called a listener, someone who could attend public meetings, social gatherings, and business conferences where pro-slavery politicians and businessmen might reveal information about their plans. My blindness made me appear harmless and forgettable, allowing me to gather intelligence that was crucial to the abolitionist cause. Catherine and I worked together for several years. She as an organizer and fundraiser, I as an intelligence gatherer. We helped hundreds of fugitive slaves reach safety in Canada, and our information about pro-slavery activities helped prevent several attempts to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Act and expand slavery into new territories. But my most important mission during those years was personal: the search for my wife Sarah and our children Samuel and Mary. Catherine used her connections and resources to help me trace their movements after they had been sold from Magnolia Estate in 1854. The search took 6 years and led us through a network of slave markets, plantation records, and Underground Railroad contacts across the South. We followed leads from Mississippi to Louisiana to Texas, always one step behind the people I loved most in the world. In 1862, we finally found Sarah on a cotton plantation outside Houston, where she had been sold after her previous master's death. The reunion was bittersweet. She was alive and relatively healthy, but the years of separation had aged her beyond her years, and the constant uncertainty about the fate of our children had taken a terrible toll on her spirit. Our children, we learned, had not been so fortunate. Samuel had died of fever in 1858 on a plantation in Louisiana, just 14 years old and still dreaming of the day his family would be reunited. Mary had lived longer, surviving until 1860, but she had succumbed to the brutal working conditions on a sugar plantation in southern Louisiana, dying at the age of 16 without ever seeing her parents again. The news of our children's deaths was, music, devastating, but it was also liberating in a strange way. Sarah and I could finally stop searching, stop hoping, stop living in the limbo of uncertainty that had defined our existence since our forced separation. We could grieve properly for our lost children and begin to build whatever life remained to us. The Civil War had begun by the time we were reunited, and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 officially freed all slaves in the rebellious states. Sarah and I settled in Philadelphia, where I continued my work with the Underground Railroad, and she found employment as a seamstress for families who supported the abolitionist cause. We were never able to have more children. We were both too old, and the trauma of losing Samuel and Mary had left deep scars that never fully healed. But we found purpose in helping other families stay together, in using our experiences to prevent other parents from suffering the losses we had endured. In 1865, when the war ended and slavery was officially abolished throughout the United States, Sarah and I attended a celebration in Independence Hall, where the Emancipation Proclamation was read aloud to a crowd of former slaves and their supporters. As I listened to those words that officially ended the institution that had defined and constrained my entire life, I thought about the long journey that had brought me to that moment. I thought about the lightning strike that had taken my sight, but given me the ability to hear truth that others thought were hidden. I thought about the 5 years I had spent gathering secrets in the shadows of Magnolia Estate, waiting for the right moment to strike back at my oppressors. I thought about Catherine's courage in helping me expose her own family's crimes, and about the justice that had finally been served. Most of all, I thought about Samuel and Mary, the children I had lost to a system that treated human beings as property. Their deaths had not been in vain if their story and mine could help ensure that no other families would be torn apart by the cruelties of slavery. Sarah died in 1868, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated hardships of a lifetime spent in bondage. I held her hand as she passed, grateful that we had been able to spend her final years together in freedom, even though that freedom had come too late to save our children. I lived for 2 more years after Sarah's death, continuing to work with organizations that helped former slaves adjust to freedom and build new lives. My blindness, which had once seemed like a curse, had become my greatest asset. It allowed me to listen carefully to the needs and concerns of people who were struggling to navigate a world that was still hostile to their presence. I died peacefully in my sleep on March 10, 1870, at the age of 54. My funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives I had touched during my years of freedom. Former slaves I had helped escape, abolitionists I had worked with, and families I had helped reunite. Catherine, now a prominent figure in the women's suffrage movement, delivered the eulogy. She spoke about the power of patience, the importance of listening, and the courage required to speak truth to power, even when the cost might be everything you hold dear. Ezra Washington, she said to the assembled Moors, taught me that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, that the powerless are not necessarily helpless, and that the ability to hear truth is more valuable than the ability to see lies. He showed me that blindness is not always a disability. Sometimes it is a different kind of sight, one that sees past appearances to the reality beneath. Most importantly, he proved that patience and persistence can overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. He waited 5 years to strike back at his oppressors, gathering their secrets like weapons, and when the time was right, he used their own words to destroy them completely. Let his story be a reminder that justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied forever. Let his example inspire us to listen carefully, act wisely, and never give up hope that truth will eventually triumph over lies, that right will eventually overcome might, and that even the most powerless among us can find ways to change the world. My gravestone in Philadelphia's Eden Cemetery bears a simple inscription, Ezra Washington, 1816 to 1870. He heard everything, he remembered everything. He used everything to set his people free. But perhaps my true monument is not carved in stone, but lives on in the countless families that remain together because of the work I did. The former slaves who found freedom because of the intelligence I gathered, music, and the understanding that even the greatest disadvantages can become advantages when viewed through the lens of patience and determination. The Bogard family name disappeared from Mississippi history. Their crimes remembered only as cautionary tales about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. Magnolia Estate was eventually converted into a school for freed slaves, a fitting end for a place that had once been a monument to oppression. But the lessons of my story continue to resonate, that those who are underestimated possess the greatest power of all. That patience can be the most devastating weapon, and that the ability to listen carefully and remember accurately can bring down empires built on lies and cruelty. I lost my sight in a lightning storm, but I gained something far more valuable. The ability to see the truth that others tried to hide, and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to use that truth as a weapon of justice. In the end, that was enough to destroy my enemies and help free my people. The darkness that had taken my vision became the shadow in which I hid while gathering the light of truth that would eventually illuminate the crimes of those who thought themselves untouchable. And in that light, justice was finally served. While the specific story of Ezra Washington and the Bogard family represents a fictionalized account, it is grounded in the documented realities of antebellum slavery and the various forms of resistance employed by enslaved people. The use of apparent disability as a form of camouflage for resistance activities has been documented in several historical cases, though none as extensive as the 5-year intelligence gathering described in this narrative. The legal and social networks that enabled corruption among the planter elite were real features of antebellum Southern society and the kinds of crimes attributed to the Bogard family. Murder, rape, fraud, and land theft were unfortunately common among those who possessed unchecked power over others. The Underground Railroad and abolitionist networks described in the story accurately reflect the real organizations that helped enslaved people escape to freedom and worked to expose the brutalities of slavery to Northern audiences. The story of Ezra Washington serves as a reminder that resistance to oppression takes many forms, that apparent weakness can become strength, and that the patient accumulation of truth can be more powerful than any physical weapon in the fight for justice. The echoes of Ezra's patient vigilance still resonate through history, a testament to the power of listening, the strength found in apparent weakness, and the truth that those who are underestimated often possess the greatest capacity for justice. His story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that patience can, music, be the most devastating weapon, and that the ability to hear truth in a world full of lies can music ultimately bring down even the mightiest oppressors. If these powerful narratives of hidden strength and ultimate justice move you, join our community of truth seekers. Subscribe to discover more hidden stories from America's most challenging chapters and share your thoughts on how one man's blindness became the light that exposed a family's darkness. Your engagement helps ensure these vital stories of resilience and justice continue to inspire and educate future generations.